Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices for Views, ViewModels, and ViewControllers, hosted by Sentia. My name is David Green. I am Marketing Manager at Sentia and will be moderating today's webinar. I am pleased to introduce today's presenter, Mark Guzmano, Sentia Product Expert. Before I hand the mic over to Mark to kick off the webinar, I'd like to take a moment to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on demand on the BrightTalk platform. Additionally, we will host a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If at any time during the webinar you have a question, please submit it via the questions panel. Mark, you now have the floor.
David, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. We're going to discuss one of the central topics of Ext JS development, at least recently. It's the subject of views and view models and view controllers. Now, if you're a developer that hasn't yet moved into version 5 and above, you may not have heard these terms, at least not in the way that I will describe them. Or you may just be getting into Ext JS and kind of wonder what these are and how to use them, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to give you an understanding of what these terms are, why they're useful, why you build views, view models, and view controllers. We'll look at the examples of how you interact between these various view model, and view controller environments, why we would do it, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the effects of using the view model environment, especially things like data binding. So we've got a pretty good feature-laden and demo-oriented webinar for you. So hope you get a lot out of it and enjoy the content. So I am Mark Guzmano. I am a Sentia evangelist. I've been with Sentia formerly as an architect, and I was a customer for a while. So I've been doing Ext JS development for quite a long time, even before the advent of MVC within the Ext JS environment. So as I said, this may be a new topic to you, or you may have heard MVC bantered about, or MVVM, or some derivation of that. So I thought I'd start out with a little bit of a discussion of what this MVC thing is all about. It really addresses the concept of separation of concerns, meaning we've got several things going on when we're building an Ext JS application. We've got our visual view, which are things like grid, buttons, panels, things that are visual on the page. We've got functionality or logic, so what code you run when you click a button, for example, the click event of the button. And then we have data. Data can be as simple as the text for the title of something. It can be as complex as an Ext JS data store. So those three things, although you could write one big monolithic application and include everything in that one big file, tend to be best if separated. And the concept of separation really falls along the three lines that I just described. A separate view, or a separate view file, in our case a separate view JavaScript file, a separate controller, or in the case of Ext JS, a view controller. Some of you may have worked with other forms of controller, an application global controller within XJS. A view controller is a very different thing, and we'll give you kind of the subtlety of what's different about it from an application controller. And then the concept of a model, or in the case of Ext JS, a view model. So those are the three fundamental things that comprise an MVC for separation of concerns. So if you're interested in a little bit more details, there's actually quite a bit of details out on the web. One I happened to find that I thought was pretty good was this article on programming fundamentals, which I've linked to. I could have picked other ones, but one fascinating thing about this article to me was two new words that I learned. Programmers and sys scripters. So for my brothers and sisters, I guess. So now in my vocabulary, I can call my programming buddies my programmers and the women cis scripters. So hopefully if you take nothing out of this presentation, you've got 2 new words in your vocabulary, 2 new geeky words that you can use that I just thought were interesting. All right, so given this MVC environment, let's talk about how this looks within an Ext JS application. So in order to do this, we obviously want to generate an Ext JS application. And there are 2 ways to generate an application. One using the Open Tools Ext tool. And the other way, the more traditional way, is using Sencha command. So either way will get you to a starter application. You can build classic applications, you can build modern applications, you can build what are called universal applications, which is both desktop and mobile, either with classic or modern. We're not going to go into all those details. The key here is to generate an app so that we can use it to describe what MVC is all about. One thing I will distinguish between these 2 ways of generating an application is that if you generate an app with Sencha command, which is the Sencha generate app on the bottom, the resultant template that's used by default does not really adhere to the MVP principles and best practices that I'm going to describe in this webinar. If you build an app with Ext, the templates that are in there are a little bit more advanced, and they do adhere to what I'm going to describe in this article, or in this webinar. It doesn't mean you can't copy or create the files that I'm going to demonstrate. It's just that if you really want to just grab them from a template, the Ext application is going to be your better bet. So either way, you generate an application. In this particular situation, I've generated an application with Sencha command. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, this is the application right here. Let me close it down just to give you a look at it. For those of you that use Sencha command or used Ext JS, this should look pretty similar to applications you've built. There's an app.json. There's an app that starts everything off. In this particular case, I'm going to focus on using the classic toolkit, just because I decided to use it in this case. The MVC concepts are almost identical between the classic and the modern toolkit. So don't feel that you only will get what I'm talking about by using one or the other toolkits. They pretty much are both applicable. So we'll come back and look at some of the structure of this as we start discussing the MVC concepts. So let's go ahead back into our code here and talk about some of the best practices. So you can build an Ext JS application, excuse me, without MVC. You can build one big JavaScript file if you really wanted to and put absolutely everything into it. That would be very hard to maintain. It would be very hard to modularize, hard to trim for performance, but it's technically feasible. On the other hand, you can build more organized packages, and in particular, something that I've termed a view package. Now, that might not be an official term, but I think it's very helpful to understand it as a view package. So the view package, think of it as a folder in your project that contains the necessary files for an MVC application. So in this particular screenshot, I have a view, a ViewModel, and a ViewController. And I'm really sticking to a naming standard here that I believe makes things a lot easier to use as you start building a lot of these view packages. So the naming standard is you come up with a name. So in my case, it's going to be personnel. And then for the view, you add a suffix of view. So personnel view. For the view model, it's personnel view model, which is right here. And then finally, personnel view controller. So nice and organized. And if you keep that naming structure, no matter where you are, no matter what file you have open, you'll understand what file you're in. Probably the biggest one that kind of isn't followed as much as the others is the view. A lot of times you'll just see the name. The view might be called personnel.js, which is totally fine, except when you're staring at it in your editor and it says personnel.js. What is that? Is that the view? Is that a view model? Is that just some arbitrary file? So I like keeping this standard when creating my MVC collection of files. You'll also notice a couple other files in here that aren't technically part of MVC. They kind of are, but I like including them in a standard package. The SAS or CSS file, so optionally you can have CSS that's oriented just towards this view. So technically the personnel view.css file is part of the view. The CSS is only going to be used for the view. And then the other one I sometimes like to put in a view package is a view store. As we'll talk about in a bit, you can define stores within a view model, or you can define stores just as a regular Ext JS class. There are benefits to both, and if you're using a store just for a particular view, just for ease of use and ease of finding it, I find it helpful to put that store within the view package folder. Other people like putting all their view or all their stores inside a global store folder. No right or wrong answer. I just prefer this if indeed my store is just used by this view. What's nice about this approach is that you can take the entirety of this view package and move it to another project, and if you really isolated the concerns, everything about that view will be in that folder. All the code for it, all the data for it, even the store will be in that folder. So it's something to consider. As I mentioned earlier, the ViewController is a unique thing with MVC. There is a concept of an app controller, and these are very different concepts. An app controller that's been around for a while with the Ext JS is a global thing. So you can create an app controller and essentially see it from every view you create in your application. A ViewController, on the other hand, is only visible to the view that associates itself with the ViewController. And on top of that, if you create multiple instances of this view, you will get different instances of the ViewController. So it really makes for a much more organized environment. View app controllers can be treated like view controllers. You can have an app controller that just has code within a view, but it's very tempting not to maintain that. I've seen app controllers that have so much code in it that it's hard to tell which function goes with what. And it makes it very hard to manage, maintain, and definitely hard to migrate if you want to migrate from an app controller environment to a view controller environment. So even if you are not yet in a version that has view controllers, start thinking view controllers. And what that means is one view, one controller. That's a good thing to be thinking about. So we're going to have our standard view package, and I'm going to just give you an idea of what that looks like in the project that we're in. If you look down here in the classic view folder, we've got two views here, or we've got two folders, I should say. We've got a main folder, and we've got a personnel folder. Since I generated this application with Sencha command, as I mentioned, Sencha command doesn't really provide this robust MVC view package set of template starters. So if you look at main.js, first off, it's a view, and it doesn't say main view, it just says main. So that's not quite the proposed best practice of putting the suffix view on it, so that's one little difference. Then you'll also notice that this particular main, which is the starter root view of the application, brings in child views with a, in this particular case, a tab element. And you'll notice that the child views kind of are all over the place in terms of names. This one says main list. It's an X type main list, which happens to be the X type of list. I find it very confusing when you don't keep consistency. What I like to do in the view is have the name be personnel view, as I mentioned, have the X type also be personnel view. The only difference being the X type by convention has all small letters. So whenever I see the X type personnel view, I immediately know a couple of things. I know it's a view. I know it's in a file of the same name. And if I followed these naming standards, I know it's in the view, name of the view, name view.js folder. It becomes very consistent from a naming and standards point of view to name things like that. So the view file is one of the files. We're going to get into the details in a bit here. The view model is another file that is part of MVC. As you can see, its name is view model. And it also follows the standard of the equivalent to its X type is that name all in small letters. And what do I mean by the equivalent to its X type? An alias is really an X type with a prefix on it. So by convention, views use the X type, which is really alias something.personnel view. The view model just goes by the alias something.personnel view model, which is a view model. If we go into the view controller, the view controller follows that same pattern. Alias, controller dot, and then this name is identical to this name. So consistency. They don't all have to be the same name, but from a consistent point of view, it makes it easier to understand. So the biggest thing here is that all three of these files, the M, the V, and the C, interact with each other. That's the whole idea. They're isolated in terms of what they do, but they interact with each other. That interaction or that connection is done in the view itself. So notice here, lines 6 and 7. The view connects to the view model and connects to the controller. So there's a view model config and there's a controller config. And more or less, they're connected by their aliases. So this one is personnel view model, and this one is personnel view controller. So again, very consistent and bringing all three of the files together, and they all will interact in some way. And that's what we're going to spend some time understanding. So we have a view package. They have consistent names, at least my preference is they do. And we connect them all together. So we have already seen in the view the connection between a view model and the view controller. So that view model, which has a name personnel view model in this case, is the alias of the view model. The controller's ID is the alias of the view controller. So that's basically how all three of these are connected together. You'll also notice that in each of these, they extend from some base Ext.js class. In the view, you extend from Ext.component or some derivative of Ext.component. So any child, like a grid panel or a container, anything that is based on Ext.component can participate in an MVC environment. In the view model, you extend from ext.app.viewModel. And then finally in the view controller, it's ext.app.viewController. Remember, not app controller, view controller. So that's how you connect everything together. So now let's talk a little bit about how you interact between them. So I'm going to talk at a high level about that, and I'm going to get into demo mode, and we're going to take a look at that. So there's a couple of things to note about the two places where actually, in all three places, you could potentially have code. Although by best practices, your code is in the view controller. So even though by best practice, the view should not contain code, you can have code. And the first place you can inject code besides the constructor into your view is a method called init component. So init component, for all practical purposes, is the starting point for writing code if you were writing code in the view. Similarly, if I go to the view controller, there is a function called init. So the init function in the view controller is like that starter point, short of the constructor, where you can start writing code in that particular JavaScript file in XJS. So we've got init controller and we've got init. So I'm going to show you how those both can be used. We also have a view model, and as I said, all three of these can potentially have code in them. You don't have any code in there's three sections here. There's a data section, a formulas section, and a stores section of a view model. The data section typically does not have code. It just has identifiers of data elements. The formulas section typically does have code. Formulas are code to manipulate the values of data. I thought that was a little too much to go into with the best practices discussion, so I don't have anything in formulas, but you could technically have code in a view in a formula. And then the third area is you can identify or you can define Ext JS stores within the stores section. And the stores section gives you the ability to data bind to stores, and we'll talk about data binding in a bit. So that's really the structure of a view model. You see, I haven't used much here. I've just used data. And then in the view, we have a init component. So let's take a look at these within the code. I think it's probably easiest just to show you all of this within the code itself. So as a review, we have the personnel view, which is the view of our MVC environment, and it has an init component. We have the view controller, and it has an init. And then we have the view model, which is data. And then, as I said, optionally, you can have some CSS or Sass code. You'll notice there's just some CSS here that can be associated with the view with the CLS parameter. So I kind of consider this part of the view itself, just to kind of isolate the CSS if you choose to do that. And then, as we'll see in the view itself, this particular view is going to do a creation of a grid or a grid panel. And one of the things we need for a grid panel is a store. And in this particular case, I decided not to data bind the store or use the store section of the view model. I decided to create my own store as an XJS class. So if you look at the personnel view store, this is just an ext define of a store just like any other store. So you've got some capabilities here. Technically, in the MVC model, this would be part of the model because it's data. But let's focus on view, view controller mostly, and a little bit on view model. So let me go ahead and run this application just to give you an idea what it does. It doesn't do a lot, but it's good for description purposes. So I've started a Sencha app watch on this application. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and basically just run this itself. So you'll notice here, if you've ever done Sencha command, this is a generic Sencha command generated application. What I've done is I've added one additional tab for personnel here. If I hit F12 in Chrome and go over to the console, you'll see that most everything I've done in this example is just spitting out console.log statements. So if I rerun this, you'll see that I hit my init component, which is that initialization file in the view. I've hit init, which is the initialization file in the view controller. And you can see that init component comes first before init does. That's sometimes important if you're writing code in both places. And then I've got a couple of buttons up here. If I click this button, some things happen. I click button 2. We'll see what these things do as I decipher the application. So pretty simple application. I like keeping things simple when discussing concepts. Makes it easier to understand. So let's go back and look and tear this thing apart and see what we learn about MVC. So in a view, you may want to communicate with the ViewController and the ViewModel. So in a view, you can get access to the ViewController and the ViewModel. And there's actually 2 ways to get a hold of the ViewModel, and I want to showcase those 2 ways. I'm going to start with this one. So this .get ViewModel gets you the ViewModel, and this .controller gets you the ViewController. ViewModel.get will get any data out of the ViewModel. So what data do we have in the ViewModel? We have name. So if I go back up here and I see, okay, what I'm doing is I'm getting the ViewModel, I'm getting the name in the ViewModel, and I'm just doing a console.log. So let's tack that first situation first. So if I refresh the page here, I can see here that on line 22, I print out personnel, which was the data that was in the ViewModel. But let me do something here. Let me comment out the ViewModel. What does that mean? Does that mean this does not have a ViewModel? Or does it mean something else? It actually can mean something else. ViewModels are inheritable. So this personnel view is created as a child of this main view. And this main view has a ViewModel. And the main view ViewModel has data. And that data will be something potentially different from the one that was in the ViewModel for personnel. So let me run this again. And you'll notice I get null because I actually don't have a ViewModel here. And I think I put one in and then I took it out. So the idea would be if this ViewModel, this main ViewModel, which I could create, if it was there, the retrieval of data would be at this main level. Why is that important? Let's say you're building an application and you have 5 child views, and they all want to refer to the same data. The technique that you would use using MVC is that you would put that data in one common spot, which is the parent of all the children, and then through that ViewModel interaction, I could get access to the data at its parent. Since I don't have that ViewModel here, that's not going to work, so I'm going to put back the ViewModel at this level. ViewModels are the only thing that are inheritable. Now, if I go back here and I take a look here, the ViewModel, I thought the ViewModel was there. It turns out that there's a separate call called lookup ViewModel. So in reality, if I comment this out, let me run this one more time. So if I comment this out and use the lookup ViewModel, you'll notice that something did happen this time. It didn't have an error. It got a value of my app. And my app is the data for the ViewModel for the parent. So in reality, I thought I had an error, but it turns out I was just using the wrong call. So best practice for ViewModel, in my opinion, is lookup ViewModel. Because lookup ViewModel, if I have a ViewModel at the same level, we'll get the view data at that level. So you'll notice this says personnel now. But if there is not a ViewModel at this level, the lookup ViewModel will look up the tree define data until it finds a view model that has that data. So get view model does not do the traversal of the parent. Lookup view model does. There are times when you don't want to get data from the parent, and that's where you would want to use get view model. But I like using this as a best practice because you'll never get the error that I got before. So that's getting view model data from the view programmatically. But that's really not the benefit of view models. If I could get the data programmatically, then what do I need? What's the concept of a view model? It's just a way to store data. Here's the real value of view models. It's data binding. So the idea here is that using the bind syntax and then putting in a config and a name with single quotes and these squiggly brackets, this says fill in the value of title with whatever the value of name is in the view model. So when I'm running, you'll notice that the title here is personnel. If I go back and I comment this out and I run this again, you'll notice the title is my app. So data binding gives me the ability to dynamically use whatever data is from the view model. That's okay, but that's not thrilling either. I could have just assigned that data when I ran. What's the real benefit? The real benefit is when I clicked here, I clicked button 2. Button 2 somehow changed the title to new name. So let's take a look. Let's traverse button 2 to see how that name changed. But to do that, we have to start introducing some of the concepts of the view controller. So let's go back to our code here, and let's look at how we defined those 2 buttons. So on the view, very simply, we defined a top bar. T bar means top bar. There's a B bar if you want the toolbar to be on the bottom. And we have 2 buttons. You'll notice the button has a handler, or a click event is essentially what a handler is. And the name of the handler. So when I click button 1, I want to call the function onClick button 1. When I click button 2, I want to call the function onClick button 2. But those functions aren't here. Where would those functions be? Well, the view controller is responsible for code. Those are pieces of code. Those are functions. Those are processes. So if I go over to the view controller, I will find onClick button 1 and onClick button 2. So separation of concern. My view just has the definition of what my user interface looks like. My view controller has the logic. Now, I'm not following that completely because of this init component. So there's code inside the view, but I'm using it for demonstration purposes. So a lot of what we're doing here, I could have done in the init function of the controller, but don't worry about that for the moment here. So I now know how to communicate somewhat between the view and the view controller, because as soon as I click this button, I go to a view controller function. Let's go over to the view controller and see how it communicates with the view and the view model, because they all have to communicate with each other. So let's start with the easier case, button 2. So in a view controller, if I want to get the corresponding view model, I do get view model. And you may ask me, you might say, Mark, does get view model break if I inherit the view model? The answer is no. So there's a little bit of an inconsistency here. There are not 2 methods to get the view model from the controller. This will get the inherited view model or the view model at your level. You don't have to have a different function for it. But once I get that view model, here's where the power of data binding comes in. I can set any piece of data in the view model to any value. So in this case, simply doing a set of name to new name does all the programmatic work necessary to change anywhere where name is bound to its new value. Admittedly, I haven't done much. I've just done a data bind to one field, but imagine I had a complex application where I had that name all over the place. That would automatically change when I changed the view model value. Now, there are some issues and caveats with that, and I'm going to save that to the end because I want to talk about some of those things. But in general, the view model provides for data bindable pieces of data that the view can consume with the bind syntax, and a view controller has programmatic access to the view model. So there's that connection. So view controller access to view model through the get view model method. How about the view controller's access to the view? So what if I need to somehow access the view directly? Well, let's take a look at the init function. Remember, the init function is the first function called by a view controller. Notice the parameter, the first and only parameter of the init function. It is the view it is associated with. So if I wanted to take the X type of the view, so the X type of the view is currently personnel view, right? So if I look at the init and I look at the first console.log, it prints out personnel view. It's printing the X type of the view that is associated with this view controller. So if I'm in the init statement, if I'm in the init function, I have direct access to the view because it's a parameter. What if I'm not in the init? How do I get access? Well, let's take a look at a scenario here. I have my init component making a call to a function that's in the view controller. That function is called called from view. So let me find called from view. Right there. Okay. So first off, this is the first time I've wanted to make a function call to something in the view controller that wasn't a handler or a click event. Remember, this right here kind of gave me an automatic access. This said the handler or the click event, by definition, is in the view controller. But what if I just want to call a function raw that's in the view controller? Here's what I do. I get the controller, which gives me the view controller, and then I can make method calls on any function that's inside the view controller. So I'm in the view, I have the view controller, I call a function called from view, calls this function right here. Now I'm in the view controller, but I'm not in the init event, and I want to call back to the view. How do I do that? Well, there's a get view method. So the get view method, which is available in the init function, so you don't have to pass this parameter if you don't want. But the get view method of the view controller gives you access to the view that is associated with that view controller, or in this case, personnel view. So what can I do there? I can get the X type, I can do this, I can set some text of one of the things on the view. That's the next thing I'm going to talk about, because there's a lot of things on the view, right? There's a grid panel, there's button 1, there's button 2. So every one of these things is a different component on the view panel. And I can have these things in a deep nested hierarchy. The toolbar could have an intermediary panel, and the intermediary panel could have another intermediary container, and that intermediary container could have a button. So it used to be that the way you found things on a view was a series of up and down statements. So if I wanted to find this button, I would say, give me the grid panel and go down to the button. But what if I then move that button into a hierarchy like I just described? I would have to say, give me the button, go down to the panel, then go down to the container, then go down to the button. That made your code very brittle. As soon as you changed the organization of your UI, your code would break. So in the MVC environment for Ext JS, there is a concept of a reference. And there are other ways to do this. You can use item ID. Frankly, you could use the actual ID, but that's not best practice. I'm going to talk about the preferred way to do it, which is a reference. So for every component except for the root component, you can provide a reference. So the reference to this button is button 1. The reference to this button is button 2. Why no reference to the root component? Because I can always just say get view, and I get that view. So what if in the view controller, I wanted to set the text of one of these buttons? How do I do that? Well, I have a reference defined, and I think best practices for me at least is if you're going to use the reference approach, give every component that you'll potentially connect with a reference. There are some performance implications to that. A reference does create something, and there's discussions about that maybe not being best practice, but as long as you're reasonable in your views, I think that's not a bad practice. So we have a reference to the component. Let's go back to the view controller. Remember, what I'm doing is I'm starting in a init component, starting in the view. I call a view controller function from the view, and in the view controller function, I want to call back to one of the referenced fields of the view. That's where I use this.lookup or this.lookup reference. This.lookup reference was initially what was introduced, and then a synonym, this.lookup, I think it's available after, I don't remember what version it was in, but with the latest version, you can use either. So this.lookup says, hey, look up the reference named button 1. And that becomes the component. So that button 1 variable now has all the characteristics of that component in XJS, like the get text setter. So, or getter, I should say. So in this particular case, I'm not setting the button text, I'm getting it. So I get the text and I console log it. So if we look at the output of this, we'll see that the output just outputs the name of the button. So again, to review this, I'm in a view controller. If I want to get the root component, I call get view, because that's available to me. I can do anything I want to the root component. If I want any other component anywhere in the hierarchy, I look up its reference. You can see how this is a lot less brittle than that up and down syntax, right? It doesn't matter where this button is, where this reference is. You just reference it by the name. So you can move it around, you can put it under a hierarchy, as long as you don't change the name. It will always be this.lookup in the value. And so this is how I communicate with a component on the view from the view controller. And then I can just do getters and setters. So I think that gives us most of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of the syntax. I would encourage you to play around with the syntax. Like I said, the best practice really is no code in the view. So what would you do in this case? It looks like I wanted to, call this initially, right? So if I didn't have a init component, what would I do? What if when this thing runs, how do I called from view if I don't have an init component? Well, now we know that init component is for the view, and init is for the view controller. So when we go to the view controller, go to the init, and instead of calling ViewController.called from view, this is actually in the same class. I just call this. And this is just the class keyword. So this is how I would, per best practice, call some initialization code that might be somewhere else in the view control. And they should work. Yep, called from view. It's no longer, it was a bad name to, that was not a good name I chose for it because it's no longer called from view, it's called from ViewController, but you get the idea. This function is called within the ViewController, just with the keyword of this, because everything is an instance of a class. All right, hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but I do see a lot of people with a lot of questions about how you use these things and how you communicate between them. Let me talk just a little bit about just some caveats or things to think about when you do some of this, and then I'll open it up for questions. The one thing I want to talk about is just some of the effects of using data binding. So the way I'm going to show you that is I'm going to open up the Performance tab, and I'm going to quickly run a performance scan on this application. And by the way, if you've never used the Performance tab in Chrome, you should learn it. It's an invaluable tool to figure out what your application might be doing, where it has performance bottlenecks. I think I'm going to be doing a webinar to dive a little bit into the performance capabilities, but I'm just going to run it real quick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on performance, I'm going to refresh the page, and I'm going to turn it off. So when you do this, you get a lot of information, as you'll see in a second here. So you get a lot of information about how this application was running, and it looks overwhelming. But basically, it's a timeline, and then it goes into every single function call that's made, whether it's your function call or the framework's function call. And so you really can start getting granular on exactly what your application is doing or not doing. I want to show you one thing at the end of this. So you can also see when if you notice up here, there's a little timeline. The application shows up right around there. And it's hard to see, but between the two things I'm toggling between, there's no My App, then there's a My App. So the title doesn't exist initially, then it exists. Why is that? Because those fields are data bound. And those data bound fields are happening after the fact in an Ext JS task. So your code finished here. An Ext JS task runs after the fact, and it does binding. So there's the bind notify. So one nuance of data binding is it does not happen synchronously. It happens asynchronously, which is not noticeable for, showing a title. Well, it could be noticeable, I guess. It could be problematic if you expect that right after you set a bind variable, the variable's value is available, because it's not necessarily available because it's done asynchronously. The other thing I'll mention about data binding is that if you data bind something and then you get rid of the page where it's been bound, the data binding has to rip apart the binding capability, which takes time. So if you're building an application that has a lot of components on it and has a lot of data binding, then performance may be an issue, because even though you're deleting a panel, it may take a while to delete because all the binds have to be undone. And then the new panel you're creating, all the binds have to be redone asynchronously. So just something to think about with data binding. Data binding is a very powerful technique. Just be careful if you're going to use it with a whole lot of components, because it might have some side effects you're not completely aware of. Okay, so I think, yep, we're getting to that point where we've just got about 10 minutes left. So I think I will stop my talking here and see if if we have any questions. So, David, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you so much for the presentation, Mark. I really appreciate the time that you took out of your day to come here and give us this this live demo. Before we start questions, I would like to take a minute to tell everybody here about our upcoming JavaScript Days event. We're teaming up with our sister companies Forwalla and Fusion Charts to host a full day of JavaScript sessions to help you take your development to the next level. I'm going to put up an event site on the screen momentarily, so check it out and choose the sessions that interest you. That said, it looks like we do have a few questions that have been submitted. If you're still with us and have a question, please submit it via the questions panel. All right, so our first question that came in asks, as we see JS frameworks moving more toward a view-only approach, Vue, React, can Sencha Ext JS be used as a view-only? I understand the MVC approach similar to Angular. However, I would like to know if I could use Ext JS as a view-only app. I would like to send ViewModel from server and bind Ext JS Views to that data.
There was a lot in that question. I heard the word server, so the only way you pass data from a server to an Ext JS application is through conventional means like RESTful interfaces. So there's no server side to Ext JS as of this moment. So you can't pass data binding on the server side if that's what you're referring to. As far as a view-only app, I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, but you could absolutely build, an app that doesn't do any updating. I'm probably not interpreting the question the way you asked it, so either re-ask the question or feel free to send me an email and clarify, and I'd be happy to dive into more details on it.
Great, and if we have time at the end, I can read through the question again, but we will move on to the next question. So the next question asks, in the view, is there a difference when using X-type personnel view and alias widget.personnel view?
That's a good question. As you saw, there's a little bit of a shorthand syntax only for views. So the question is referring to this. The shorthand for a view says X-type. The shorthand for absolutely everything else is an alias. As a matter of fact, there's an alias for this. If I were to do this, if I were to say alias, A-L-I-A-S, and then I say widget.personnel view, as far as I know, these are exactly the same. As far as I know. I don't know if there's some subtlety between those two. So this is an either-or proposition. You can either use the alias syntax to be consistent with all the other components, or this shorthand syntax that's very unique to views. I always use X-type. I have never heard that there was anything subtly different from alias and X-type on a view, but I don't want to say absolutely because I may be wrong. But I think they're interchangeable.
Great, thank you. So our next question that came in asks, can we have a recorded version of this session for future reference? And I would like to just go ahead and say yes. The session will be available to view on our Resource Center or right here on our Bright Talk channel. You can always come back and view it again at a later date. The next question asks, is this available in Ext 6.0.1?
Is it available? Data binding, yes. When I first saw that question, I thought they might have been asking, is this particular thing available? This lookup reference versus lookup. Data binding has been, I think, technically available since version 5. I think I'm right. Maybe wrong. But as I mentioned, there's this lookup reference lookup thing came in this. I thought it was 6.0.1 or something like that. But yes, version 4, no. So that's probably the biggest challenge when people are trying to upgrade from version 4 into the 5+ environment. You didn't have view controllers, you didn't have data binding, so obviously you didn't write your application to take advantage of those things. So what we usually see as a best practices recommendation is don't try to do two things at once. Don't try to upgrade from version 4 to version 7.3 and change your infrastructure to use ViewControllers and ViewModels. Get it working syntactically. The global controllers have not been deprecated. They're still there. You don't have to use data binding. But once you do get to that point, there are a lot of advantages to rethinking your structure. Or if you're just starting out with XJS, definitely spend the time to make sure you understand the essence of what I talked about today, because it might feel a little like overkill, but when you start having a lot of views and a lot of interaction, keeping this organization really makes things easier to understand. So,
great. Thank you, Mark. The next question asks, is this lookup working in an MVC setup of XJS, and does it scan the entire DOM? Asking since up and down do minimize scanning time of the DOM.
Yeah, I just saw an MVP chat around this area. There are differences in the way lookup works, the way if you use an item ID to get at things, or if you use an ID in particular. I saw one really good fiddle that kind of demonstrated the performance differences. I'd love to get maybe whoever that was who did that to maybe publish a blog on it. That'd be great. So there are differences in some of the performance. There are some things, but within reason, if you don't have like hundreds of controls on a page, lookup would be fine. But as in anything, and you start putting hundreds of anything together in an application, the smallest of differences magnify. So I would say if you have a lot of components, yes, look at the performance of this. If you have a lot of components, consider not data binding everything. There are some subtle differences. I don't have the exact numbers though, but.
Thank you, Mark. The next question asks, how much communication should be allowed between parent views and view controllers and child views and view controllers?
How much communication? My first flippant answer is how much you need. This is a good. I like this pattern. Actually, I really like the pattern of a parent view having the view model, and then the child views kind of sharing that view model. That really makes organization work very well. There are probably a couple of subtle things you can do to enhance performance. If you notice in the code, what I've done is every time I wanted the view model, I called that get view model. This probably doesn't have a lot of performance impact, but you could take this view model and make an instance variable out of it from the start. That might save a little bit. I mean, that same thing is true if you happen to be writing code in the view and you want to instance the view controller. The other thing you can do, and it's kind of related to the last question, in the view controller, instead, if you're doing a lot of looking up of the same button over and over and over again, you can put this .lookup in a init, create an instance variable out of it. So something along these lines. You could do this. You could say, this button one. So you would incur the lookup cost once in the init function, and then since this is an instance variable, anytime you want to use the button instead of using, getting this .lookup every single time, just use this button. So you can do performance-oriented things like that.
Great, thank you, Mark. I think we have time for about one more question. Any questions that go unanswered here, we'll try and address in a blog post following the presentation. So the last question that we have here is, hello, I have form with reference, but once I obtain the form, calling form.findField results in errors. Find field is undefined. How do I go about this? Form.findField.
Off the top of my head, I don't recall that method. And that's my timer. I will have to take a look at that, and I will answer that question. We'll get a blog out with any unanswered questions, and I'll consider that one of them. So I'll do a little bit of research on that. So I'd like to do that. I also see that that speed test on reference fiddle is something we have access to, which I will also include in the blog. Thank you very much for whoever did that. I mean, I saw that on as an MVP discussion, so that'll be helpful to determine your relative cost of the different ways of getting access to variables in a view controller. I think that's what it is. And I think, did you, David, put that in actually the?
I'm sorry?
The component. No, did you? We'll get that to people. So go ahead. I think we're just about out of time.
Wonderful. Yeah, we are out of time, yes, but I do appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. Mark, I appreciate you taking the time to actually give this this live demo. I think we all really enjoyed it. We look forward to you joining us for future webinars, and we also look forward to everyone that joined us as an attendee to attend future webinars. So if you have a question that wasn't answered, we will try and get around to it in a post. We encourage you to check out our upcoming JavaScript Days event, which is included in the presenter to audience announcement underneath your screen. So please go check that out. We'll have a lot of cool presentations coming for that, and you can be on the lookout for Mark in the near future with more webinars. So
yes,
thanks everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
We're going to wrap things up. Thanks, Mark.
Bye-bye.